Hello and welcome to Restoration DIY. It's great to have you here and I hope you enjoy the video. In this episode I'll be making a vase from a section of yew log cast in epoxy resin with a segmented yew top. This one threw up a few challenges along the way, so without further ado, let's get into it. I double checked the size of the casting bucket and marked out for cutting the yew blank. By offsetting the piece to be cut, I hope to create some big offcuts for another project. With the centre marked, I drilled a hole for a steel pin. I use this to position it on the circle cutting jig. To cut a circular blank, I use a jig. It's a piece of 12mm plywood with a runner screwed to the underside, located in the bandsaw's slotted cast iron table. With the steel pin located in the correctly spaced hole, I can cut the blank. I used to change to a thinner blade, but I found it's just as quick to use the wide one and cut a series of straight lines. For the segmented top, I needed to cut this piece of yew into 3 strips, 2 at 50mm wide and 1 at 30mm wide. This would give me just enough for the required 54 segments. Then it was onto the table saw. Using the segment cutting jig set to 10 degrees, I cut the segments. This project has 3 rings, each containing 18 pieces. The segmented top was the next thing to be assembled. For this I used a 3D printed template. This gives me consistent 2mm joints between each segment. The first ring was for the rim. I used mixing sticks superglued to the top to hold it together. I didn't have to worry about these being visible because they would be easily cut away in the finished piece. And with the template removed, I placed it to one side. Normally I would have used a 3D printed spacer, but these were still being printed, so the next ring to be done was the bottom ring. Taking a lesson learned on my last project, I used more mixing sticks on what would be the base. These were cut down and split to make them thinner. These were then glued around the inner diameter so they wouldn't be visible in the finished piece. Whilst I waited for the spacers to print, I cleaned up the yew blank. The bark was pretty well stuck, so I resorted to the wire wheel to remove the loose dirt and flaky bits, and in the thinner areas, it cut through to the solid wood underneath. Once the spacers were done, I could finish the segmented top. I made them just big enough to fit the inner diameter. With the prongs pushed into the joints of the base ring, I superglued it in place. The spacers come in 2 types, a single to be glued on the top and the bottom of a blank, and a double to space out and align the inner joints. On this project, I used the mixing sticks top and bottom because of time constraints. I assembled the centre ring on top of the base ring, using the template to keep the segment joints straight and aligned. The white half-moon spacers are there to support the segments and maintain a 2mm joint between the rings. After the last segments were glued in place, I removed the template and fixed the next double spacer, ready for the top segmented ring. A section broke off the top ring, but that didn't matter. I was still able to line it up and apply more glue. There you go, that bit's done. I added a waste block to the centre and used the packing tape to add some height and snug the silicone mould around the blank. Next up, resin casting. The chosen colours were aubergine, lagoon, wine red and black for the segmented top. As is usual, each batch was thoroughly mixed for at least 2 minutes. The black batch was poured straight into the mould. The 3 colours were allowed to pre-cure before adding them to the U-blank. As the resin pre-cured, the red batch gelled much quicker, which meant I had to pour before the others were ready. Green was first, then the rest followed. The trick here is to get it all in whilst holding the blank firmly in position. If it floats, pushing it back down will mix the colours and ruin the clean separation. It's the next day, and after a night in the pressure pot, the resin has cured, or so I thought. More on that in a bit. I had a bigger problem. The segmented top had soaked up so much resin, I had no choice except to mix some more to fill the mould and then put it back in the pressure pot for another 24 hours. Before doing the top, I checked the lower blank to make sure it was okay, and apart from a couple of small voids, all was well. The top section was easily dealt with, though I wouldn't be able to work on it until the next day. That done, I set about getting the lower blank ready. I chiselled away the excess waste block, drilled an 8mm hole and fixed it to the lathe. The blank was held in place on the woodworm screw and the tailstock. I wound the speed up to around 800 RPM and set about getting it to round. The balance was already pretty good. And this is where the next problem showed itself. The blank seemed to be cutting okay, but when I stopped the lathe, I could see a big blob of soft resin on the carbide cutter. It hadn't fully cured. After a quick check on my weather app, I could see the temperature overnight had dropped to around 0. At this time of year I would normally take the pressure pot indoors to keep it warm, but because I didn't want to disturb the resin, I hadn't bothered, and this was the result. I carried on for a while longer, but it wasn't going to get any better, so I turned my attention to the base to flatten it and cut the mortise. With the thin layer of resin removed, I was left with solid timber, which took a few strokes from the skew to level off. Then I cut the mortise in the usual way, using the 1/4" parting tool to cut the recess, then the dovetail cutter to cut the dovetail. A bit of tidying up with a gouge and the skew to add some embellishment, and it was done. This was sanded, just the underside, to 600 grit, and a finish applied, topped off with Hampshire Sheen gloss finishing wax. It's the next day. I checked the segmented rim blank, and thankfully the second batch had cured, so I went back to the lower blank to level the top. I did this mainly to see how the resin in this blank was doing. It had an extra 24 hours to cure, and that had done the trick. No more soft resin. I had a rough idea how I wanted this piece to look, and I was tempted to start hollowing out, but a lot depended on the upper section, so I made sure it was nice and level, then I switched the blanks. The upper blank needed a lot of work. The top is facing the camera. I began by removing the waste resin from the outer surface. The full-size carbide makes short work of exposing the U segments. Then I switched to the bowl gouge to remove what was left of the mixing sticks and start levelling the MDF waste block. I didn't want to cut it all out, as I intended to use it for the tailstock later on. After I'd levelled the top, I could turn the blank around and expose the remaining U segments on the side, and then work on the underside. This was important. With this levelled, I could see how the two pieces matched up, and they turned out to have the same diameter, which was always the intention. Honest, it wasn't just a coincidence. What follows is just a bit of exploratory hollowing out, so I'll skip forward to the next bit. So after removing the tailstock to get better access, I had an almighty catch, which ripped the blank clean out of the coal jaws. Luckily no damage was done, so I parked that blank and set two on the lower one. The line I'm scoring into the top of the lower blank is a guide to how wide I should leave the wall thickness. This will allow for additional shaping as the design develops. The blank had a big void in the top. When I hit it with a gouge, the grip on the chuck let go, but no big drama. I was able to get it all fixed back in place, and I continued hollowing out. This was going to be a progressive thing, doing a bit on the inside, then switching to the outside, gradually developing the design. So now with the inside partially hollowed out, I had to start thinking about the final design. This piece was going to be quite tall when it was finished, so I wanted to add some shape, which for me meant a pedestal base with a deep cutout. Quickly moving on with a freshly sharpened bowl gouge, I started on the cutout. This was mostly cutting into yew timber, so the bowl gouge was the tool of choice. Working on either side of the cut, I gradually worked my way into the centre, switching to the full-size carbide to blend the resin into the timber. Having got the cutout more or less to shape, I started to refine the proportions. The base looked too big, so that was trimmed down, bringing the outer edge more in line with the sloping side. The basic shape of the lower section was done, so I went back to finish the inside. I thinned the side down, lowering the base, and once I was happy with the shape, I removed the centre support. Once the tailstock was out of the way, I used the bowl scraper to clean up the tool marks, and then I sanded to 600 grit, then up to 3000 grit on the resin, and added a finish. The lower section was put to one side, and I began working on the top section. For this, I wanted to get as much done as I could before gluing the two pieces together. After cutting away the waste resin to fully expose all the segments, I began shaping the rim. For this, I used a detail spindle gouge to undercut the top ring, creating a shallow undercut. This was followed by the bowl gouge to shear scrape a curve blending down into the side. Using both gouges and the skew, I continued refining the shape, keeping the resin joint between the two upper rings on the centre line of the recess. At this point I was very happy with the shape. A few more passes with a skew and it was done, so I turned it around and I could hollow it out. I'm not going to dwell on this bit, but the purpose here was to remove as much as I could whilst leaving some in the top to give support to the tailstock for the final shaping. And once the hollowing out was done, I sanded to 800 grit and added a finish, topped off with gloss finishing wax. Now the two pieces could be glued together. For this I used rapid setting epoxy resin mixed with black mica powder. This was spread over the jointed surface, then after fixing the lower section to the lathe, the top section was mushed into place using the tailstock to provide the necessary pressure. It's 30 minutes later, and this is where all the work I'd previously done paid off. There was very little to do. It was just a case of blending the two pieces together, beginning with the gouge, then switching to the skew to get a seamless joint. A final check and the outside was done. And whilst I had the additional support in place, I sanded all the way up to 3000 grit. Sanding done, I just had to remove what was left of the MDF waste block. This was done carefully with a full-size carbide then the 1/4" parting tool to cut through the last little bit. MDF removed and the tailstock out of the way, being so careful with carbide and skew, it was just the last bit of cleanup to do. And the shaping was done. I finished sanding around the rim up to 3000 grit and it was ready for the finish. I cleaned down with denatured alcohol. This was followed up with 2 liberal coats of sanding sealer, each one de-nibbed with a non-abrasive Scotch pad. Next up, Yorkshire grit. A single application, thoroughly cleaned away till no more residue is picking up on the paper towel. Then the resin polishing. First, Merca Polar Shine 10, a single coat, thoroughly cleaned away, ready for the next stage. Polar Shine 5, another single coat, polished off to leave a deep shine. And to finish, Hampshire Sheen Gloss Finishing Wax, 2 coats, buffed to seal and protect the surface. And that's it, another project finished, and this one took some doing. It was a very enjoyable process, ending up with a piece I'm very happy with, and I hope you like it too. As ever, the U-timber didn't disappoint. The contrast between the different materials is stunning. It gives me some great ideas for upcoming projects. Anyway, with all that said, I'd like to thank you all for watching. Please subscribe, it really helps the channel grow. A thumbs up will be much appreciated, and comments are always welcome. I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye for now.